Hello class. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 1, which covers the history of juvenile justice and how we treated early delinquency. So our learning objectives for today are that by the end, you should be able to retrace the journey of the juvenile justice system in America, summarize the history of juvenile confinement, summarize the historical themes that guided the development of juvenile justice in the U.S., present the structure and procedures of juvenile justice agencies that we use in the U.S., as well as examine the various philosophies and strategies for correcting juvenile behavior. So let's first start by talking about Mark Lipsey. So Dr. Mark Lipsey, you'll hear his name numerous times throughout this text. He's a pioneer and a well-known researcher of juvenile justice and delinquency. So in his Improving the Effectiveness of Juvenile Justice Programs, he surmised that first we need to serve youth closer to home. And you'll see where this comes into play by the end of this lesson. That we need to better connect youth to their families, to schools, their communities where they live, and to pro-social peers if we want to reduce delinquency. And finally, we need to utilize a strength-based approach. Rather than focusing on all of the negatives and what the juveniles do wrong, let's look at what they have that makes them resilient. What makes them not want to engage in delinquent behaviors, or what makes them stop engaging in delinquency. So again, this will all come together at the end of the lesson. So let's start by covering the roots of juvenile justice. So we have to begin by talking about early Europe. So in early Europe, youth under the age of 7 were not held criminally responsible for their behavior. It was looked at as an issue that the parents would deal with. Those between the ages of roughly 7 to 14, their responsibility was to be determined based on the severity of the crime they committed, how mature the juvenile was, their capacity to distinguish between right and wrong, as well as was there evidence of blatant malice? So did they truly intend to harm someone else? And then we look at those youth who were held fully responsible. They determined that once they hit the age of puberty, which was roughly around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, they were held fully responsible for their behaviors. So these youth would be put into apprenticeships in a craft or a trade with wealthier families, and then that wealthier family would have full control over that child. So we need to look at the idea of parens patriae. This is going to, again, come up numerous times throughout our text. So this is where the idea of parens patriae stems from, is early Europe. So the focus here was on the sovereign protecting the subjects. So translating that to juvenile justice, we look at the juvenile justice system and the juvenile courts as trying to protect the juveniles and taking on that parental role for them. So in early Europe, youth could also be found guilty of capital offenses. There were actually 160 to 200 capital offenses that children could be executed for. Let that sink in a second. And in 1785, 18 of the 20 people who were executed in London were under the age of 18. 18 out of 20. So let's look at the colonies. Here, the family was the primary means of social control. So the family was looked at as, we will handle any issues that this juvenile presents with. Youth who were found guilty of crimes, they could experience things such as whippings, dunkings, being sent to the stocks, being expelled from their communities, and again, capital punishment. So the juvenile justice system that sort of existed in the colony times was shaped by the cultural and religious ideas of the Puritans. However, due to increased urbanization and industrialization in the 1800s, this led to reformers creating asylums and training schools that was supposed to help maintain control over these youths. So the parens patriae idea then was formalized by Ex parte Kraus in 1838, and this actually gave the courts a legal basis to intervene into the lives of children. So they could confine minors without there being any criminal behavior, and youth here also had no right to counsel or trial by jury. So the development of the juvenile court, how did it develop? Well, the first juvenile court was developed in Cook County, Illinois in 1899, and it developed out of the poor conditions that existed in the Cook County Jail and in the Chicago House of Corrections, where children were being housed with adults. The juvenile justice system was to be informal, so the judge, the parent, the child, and the probation officer would all sit and just simply discuss the case. Complaints could also be brought from citizens, from parents, police, school officials, or others. Both the hearings and any records were kept confidential. And proof of criminality was actually not needed for the youth to be able to receive court services, which we also see today in the Office of Children and Youth, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. The court also had wide discretion in determining what type of service the youth should get and in determining their disposition or their sentence. Lawyers were not required here, and the standards and procedures that were used in adult court that we saw there, where you have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that did not exist, and hearsay was actually able to be admitted into these juvenile proceedings. So by 1928, nearly every state except 2 had a separate juvenile justice system. The purpose here was rehabilitation, not punishment, which remains true today. So we have 2 different schools of thought. We have the classical school of criminology, and then we have the positivist school. So the classical school said that people choose to willingly violate laws, that people have total control over their actions, and that punishment is needed to be able to correct that behavior. The positive school came in, however, and said that people are pushed into crime by forces beyond their control, that it's biological, psychological, social, economic, political, and even environmental causes that make one engage in crime. So they felt that if you could identify the cause of the behavior, that you could cure the offender. And in the beginning of juvenile court, we had volunteers that were probation officers. Those volunteers, there was a huge push to replace them with social adjusters or social workers. And they had this Freudian psychoanalysis idea where the social workers were supposed to focus on the inner mental workings of the child to correct their delinquency, which we do see a little bit today with offering mental health services. We tend to look at the whole child rather than just their delinquency. So juvenile court today. We have 3 types of cases that can come before juvenile court. We have delinquency, which can include either acts that are considered a misdemeanor or a felony offense if it would be committed by an adult, or you have status offenses. And these are behaviors that are only an offense because the person is a juvenile. This includes things such as drinking alcohol, being ungovernable, running away from home, and truancy. Then you have dependency, and this is when youth are not engaging in criminal or delinquent behaviors, but they're just uncontrollable in the home. They're not following house rules. They may be running away from home. And then neglect. So neglect is not through no fault of the child. Neglect is when the parent is either not meeting the basic needs of the child or is abusing the youth. So this is just an interesting chart to take a look at. It's the maximum age of juvenile court jurisdiction. So this is the highest age that a youth can be and remain in the juvenile system when they're charged. So let me explain. So in Pennsylvania, you'll see it's 17. So any youth over the age of 17 is going to be considered an adult and will be charged and tried as an adult. However, the juvenile court can actually hold a juvenile and retain jurisdiction over them until they're 21, and that allows us to continue with services for that youth and that child if, say, they're in a placement or say they're finishing up with a mental health service. The service doesn't have to cut off just because they turned 18. However, you'll notice that in Texas, so I'm looking at my second screen over here. In Texas, the upper age is 16. Same in Missouri, and I believe there's one other state here that has 16. New York actually used to have 15 as the maximum age of juvenile court jurisdiction. There's been a huge push recently to raise the age so that youth under the age of 18, all youth under the age of 18 who are not considered adults yet, have access to the juvenile system and juvenile programs. But in Texas, this means that any youth over the age of 16, so those who are 17, are actually going to be charged and tried as adults. So let's look at the history of juvenile confinement. We have to start with the American Revolution. To put it simply, jail and prison conditions were deplorable. Juveniles were being confined with adults, men and women were housed together, the sane and insane, felons, misdemeanants. It didn't matter what crime you committed, what your status was, what your mental health was. You were all confined in the same prison and jails. There were also severe punishments for youth. They had fines, beatings, floggings. They could be sent to the stocks, like I mentioned before, burned, mutilated, banished. They could be sent on extended whaling voyages, which we have something similar today, which are youth forestry camps where they use the outdoors to rehabilitate the youth. But it's not like we send them on this whaling voyage and they can never return. Or they were often placed on farms with relatives, thinking that if we took them away from the cities and the urban life, that they would be able to focus more on themselves. They also had fixed sentences during this time, and they had local enforcers who were made up of either watchmen, local sheriffs, or magistrates, which were your judges. So those are the ones who would be enforcing these laws. And then we have the creation of institutions. There were two main types. We have houses of refuge and reformatory or training schools. The last one is cottage systems, which we still see even today. We don't see house of refuge, and we see training schools, but they're definitely different. It's more of the cottage system you'll see today. So let's cover those. First, the house of refuge. These were created in New York City in 1825. This was the very first school, and it was for males. Youth who were sent here were poor. They could be destitute, incorrigible, which means they couldn't be encouraged to engage in positive behaviors. They just didn't listen to anyone, or orphaned. So you see you have many different types of youth being housed in these houses of refuge here. They focused on the family model and built themselves off of that. So the institution was viewed as the home. Peers would be seen as the family of the youth. And then staff were viewed as the parents. And we do use staff, and we call them house parents in the cottage system today. But this is how they operated the house of refuge on their idea of a family model. Typically, a youth would spend 6 months to 1 year here. There was severe discipline involved and silence and order. So in a lot of the activities, even recreation, they were required to be silent and they could not speak to one another. Also, having the 6 month to 1 year time frame is an indeterminate sentence, not determinate. So it means that the youth did not know how long they were going to be there, but it typically ranged from that time. So then we look at the reformatory and training schools. So these were larger schools, and they were contracting inmate labor out, which definitely became exploitative. So it was cheap. They could have these youth working as inmate labor, and it was cheaper than hiring someone to do it. They were fortress-like, so they didn't base themselves off of this homey family model. And then we have the cottage system. So the cottage system, back then, they were things like log cabins. They were made out of brick or stone. We see the same thing today, but it's more or less this idea that there was only 20 to 40 juveniles per cottage. So rather than having one giant training school where you're housing hundreds of offenders, there's only 20 to 40, so it's much easier for them to get to know one another, much easier for staff to maintain control and maintain order. So The three major changes that affected the institutions at the end of the 19th century was one, the increasing institution population size. Two, there was a huge decrease in state funding, and they were admitting more dangerous offenders into these training schools. So how did probation develop? Well, John Augustus is viewed as the father of probation. So in 1869, we had this idea of a visiting probation agent system that developed in Massachusetts. It wasn't until 1878 that the first paid probation officer was put onto a police force because there was his first probation statute. So John Augustus believed that lawbreakers only needed a concerned person to be able to stop drinking and to straighten themselves out. So he developed the ideas of having an investigation and a screening, the idea of supervising offenders in the community, conducting an interview with them, as well as arranging for relief, employment, and education. So he was known to bail people out of jail with his own money, ensuring that they would return to their next hearing. So we also get the idea of bail from him. Juvenile courts, especially, relied on volunteer probation officers. So in 1907, the National Association of Probation Officers was created. Think about that, 1907. It wasn't terribly long ago. It was renamed the National Probation Association in 1911. So in juvenile, where an adult it's considered parole. We don't typically call it parole in juvenile, we call it aftercare. So this is where, in these times, the youth would be placed as indentured servants or as apprentices, and they'd be released once their services were completed. They'd be sent back to the families, and again, it's this idea of having cheap labor on the farms. However, today, we use aftercare workers as professionally trained workers. So this came through in about the early 1900s, right when the National Association of Probation Officers was being created, that we wanted professionally trained aftercare workers to be able to help these juveniles when they're being released back into the communities and to keep a watch over them. So there's a few historical themes throughout juvenile justice. The first one is discovering the child. And this is where we said that early society's children took on whatever role was necessary to help the families. So they would work if they needed to work, they would quit school. They were also held responsible like adults because they were looked at like many adults. However, reformers started questioning the age of responsibility here, saying that, wait a second, these are children. They cannot be held fully responsible for their actions. Then we had the increasing authority of the state. So this is where authority was started to be gradually taken away from the families and was being given to the state. We saw this as a result of high rates of divorce and single-parent families, high rates of abuse and neglect of children. We had high rates of drug and alcohol abuse, not only among parents, but also of the children. And we had a lot of adolescent or young mothers and out-of-wedlock births. So the state looked at all of this and said, we need to take authority away from the families in a lot of these cases, and we need to teach them these pro-social ideals. We'll go back here. You then have reform and retrenchment. So reform is when treatment of offenders is seen as too lenient. Retrenchment is the reduction of either costs or spending in response to economic difficulty. So during the 1960s and 1970s, there was a huge liberal agenda. So the idea was to reduce the use of training schools, divert status and minor offenders from the juvenile system, and to reform the juvenile system entirely. Then in the 1980s, we go into this get tough approach, which involved increasing restrictions on juveniles as well as sanctions. Those also include more mechanisms to transfer youth to adult court. However, in the early 2000s, we then saw a reduce of use of incarceration. We wanted to improve the conditions in juvenile facilities. We started to expand community-based options, looking at least restrictive options. So least restrictive means that you should use all available resources that you have in the community before placing that child. We also want to keep status offenders out of the juvenile system. So that was your get tough, I should say tough, get tough to go slow approaches. You have the get tough in the 1980s, and then the early 2000s. We say, wait a second, let's back it up. We're doing too much. We need to start looking at what's actually going to help these youth. Then you have this theme of threat of the dangerous poor. So we saw class favoritism here. So we saw that poor children were being processed through the system more than middle class were, because the behaviors that were being criminalized were those that poor children typically engaged in. So it was criminalizing the poor. And then the idea of this unsolvable nature of youth crime. There is no simple solution to solving youth crime. Every generation of reformers attempts to hopefully learn something from the last and hopefully does better moving forward. As you saw, we went from the liberal agenda to the get tough to go slow. We're in this huge idea of diversion now in juvenile justice, of keeping as many youth as possible out of the system. So we'll take a look at that in later chapters. Let's briefly touch on the agencies that are involved in the juvenile justice system. There are three main agencies. First, we have the police. The police are there to enforce laws and maintain order. So they engage in activities such as settling family disputes, making arrests, deterring crime, and collecting evidence. Then we have the courts. The courts are responsible for disposing of a case that's being referred by the intake division of juvenile probation. They handle neglect, dependency, and delinquency cases. And then you have correction departments. The correction departments involves, typically in most states, they're called the Department of Youth Services. So these are your juvenile probation offices who are going to supervise offenders in the communities. This also includes your day treatment and your residential programs. So again, you might have some private facilities out there, especially more ones for mental health, but the Department of Youth Services is going to have your main correctional residential programs. You can also have some training schools, although it's not like what we talked about before. They're definitely different now. And aftercare officers. It also includes your aftercare, which is included in most of your probation departments. These are just a few terms that I want to put up on a slide for everyone. So if you just go straight across, it's the equivalent to, it gives you the juvenile equivalent term to the adult system. So in the juvenile system, we call a trial an adjudicatory hearing. We call a sentencing hearing a dispositional hearing. You'll see, those are backwards. In the adult system, it's called parole. In the juvenile system, it's called aftercare. I'll make sure that's fixed on your PDF. In the adult system, it's confinement, but we commit juveniles. We hold youth in detention, not in jails. A petition is filed rather than an indictment. And we detain youth. We don't arrest youth. It was this idea of making the word sound, quite frankly, just softer and nicer than the adult system, so that youth didn't feel like they were being treated like an adult. And then this graph is also in your text, and it can be a little confusing, but it just shows you how a case could go through the criminal justice system. So rather than trying to look at it as a whole, take one piece from the left and just start following the arrows. So if we say we have a case come in from law enforcement and we move to the right, we can choose to detain the youth, you see the arrow going down, or you can not detain the youth and go right to prosecution. If you choose to detain, you go down, and you'll notice you can actually come up then and go right to the juvenile court intake. From there, the case could go for formal processing. The juvenile could be detained again. That's happened before, if they're still engaging in behaviors that they shouldn't be. And then they can maybe come back up, they'll be adjudicated on their charges, and then you'll see these different options you have over here to the right. Those are going to be your main two. They're either going to be placed on probation, or they're going to be placed in a residential facility. I would argue that you could put a third in there of community-based services because while they're still going to be placed on probation, that's where you see the non-residential disposition. It's easier to think of that as community-based services rather than non-residential dispositions. They're almost always going to be placed on probation. They could be given a consent decree, but I'm not going to confuse you with that right now. But one thing that's important to notice are all of the different places towards the bottom of this where a case can be diverted from the court system or dismissed. It's important to note that we do have mechanisms in place to try and get the youth out of the system if they don't truly need to be in there. However, in the same turn, if you look above to the criminal justice system on the upper half, there's also a number of mechanisms where that case could be transferred to the criminal justice system. Yes, the offense has to be serious enough, and it has to be either by one of three mechanisms we'll talk about in a later chapter. But I just think it's important to point that out, that not only do we try and pull youth out of the system, but unfortunately, if some of the youth are serious enough, there's a number of ways for them to go into the criminal system. So there's a few different correctional models, and you'll want to make sure you know these. The first correctional model we have is the treatment model. So this is the idea of parens patrae. The idea is that we want to find the root of the problem and treat it. We focus on rehabilitation, and there's a focus on the mental, physical, and social needs of the child. Then you have the justice model. This is the idea of someone getting their just desserts. So the severity of the punishment should match the severity of the crime. So we want here to decriminalize status offenders, have proportionate sentencing. We want training schools to be more humane and safer for youth. We want to use community service and restitution instead of more punishment, because these two are looked at as allowing the offender to make amends with their victims and with their communities. We then have the crime control model. So the first priority here is justice. We want to protect life and property of the innocent by isolating offenders. So we have severe and certain punishments under this model. This model also says that lawbreakers are abnormal, that their unlawful behavior is actually a character deficit that can be corrected through punishment and punishment alone. Then we have balanced and restorative justice. This is what we focus on huge in the juvenile justice system today. The idea here is that youth should be accountable to their victims. We should be able to increase their competencies of the offender and enhance community safety. So it's a restorative process that brings all the affected parties together to discuss how the victim can be made whole, how the community can be made safer, and how the offender is going to make those amends and how they're going to not engage in the same behavior. What are they going to do instead? Are they going to enroll in school? Are they going to get better grades? Are they going to get a job so they have money, so they stop stealing from others? So the offenders here, looking at the offenders, they're considered clients. And crime is viewed as a symptom of a breakdown in the family, disorganization within the community, and conflict within the community. It does say that juveniles have free will and that they know what they're doing and that they do deserve to be punished. However, in doing that, we need to make sure that justice is balanced so that we're addressing all of the needs of the youth, the community, and the victim. And it needs to be restorative in that we're not simply punishing the offender, but we're involving the community and the victim. So this here is it's a little blurry, but it just shows you how they all work together in the restorative process. Now, throughout the text, just want to take a brief mention of the themes in the study of delinquency that you'll see throughout the text. So the first one is delinquency prevention, which will be discussed more in chapter 2. So the prevention of delinquency can be accomplished through effective social problems. So we want to focus on resiliency, like I mentioned previously. This is when a youth can persevere in the face of difficulty through a few ways. There's the idea that it's through innate characteristics that they just internally have, because they have caring environments, or because they have the opportunity to participate in pro-social activities and engage in treatment and programs. We then look at evidence-based practices within juvenile justice. So evidence-based practices are those that are most effective, shown through scientific research. So they've studied these programs, they know that they work. And the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has identified 200 plus programs that are effective in reducing delinquency. We then have social policy and juvenile justice. So this is where we believe that we can improve the quality of young people's lives by providing ideas to effectively treat and control youth crime. So to lift youth out of poverty, we also need to protect them from abuse and neglect, ensure that they have access to health care, a quality education, which we know not all youth get, and also give them solid moral and spiritual foundations to build off of. So this idea of social policy says that effective policy for juvenile justice emerges when there's well thought out theoretical assumptions that are then supported by sound research. It sounds fancy. It's just saying that you come up with a theory, you've researched that theory and proved that it works, and now let's make social policy and let's operate the juvenile justice system because we know this works. So, in sum, early societies punished youth as adults and included corporal punishment. The family was viewed as the main source of social control until the parents' patrie ideal emerged and gave courts legal basis to intervene. Juvenile confinement began with the House of Refuge in the early 19th century, followed by reformatory and training schools, and then the cottage system, which we still see today. The historical themes that guided the development of the juvenile justice system include discovering the child, increased authority of the state, reform and retrenchment, get tough to go soft, and threat of dangerous poor, as well as the unsolvable nature of youth crime. There are also three main juvenile justice agencies that are involved in the system, including the police, the courts, and correction departments. And finally, there are four main correctional models, which include the treatment, justice, crime and control, and balanced and restorative justice. So that was your Chapter 1 lecture. Feel free to use the PDF that I posted while you're going through this and pause it at any time that you need. As always, I will tell you after every lecture, if you have any questions, if anything doesn't make sense, please reach out to me either by email, phone, stop into my office hours. I'm willing to talk about the lectures at any time if you have any questions. Enjoy your week.